So thank you so much for joining us today for Impact State of Mind. I'm John Paul Parmigiani, CEO and co-founder of Impact Hub New York Metropolitan Area. It is such an honor today to be having an event in collaboration with Communitas USA, America rather. Impact Hub New York Metropolitan Area is a nonprofit supporting entrepreneurs and change makers through programs designed to help impactful ideas succeed. We work across the New York metropolitan area broadly with focus areas in Manhattan, Queens, Newark, and Morristown, New Jersey, which is why we're especially happy today to widen the conversation a little bit to include the Bronx, which is so important. An Impact State of Mind is a virtual series created to support and connect the impact community as we continue through the COVID-19 crisis in a very virtual state. So thank you for joining for today's session, which is Spotlight Neighborhood, Community-Inspired Health and Wellness Solutions from the Bronx. It's such an honor to have you. I'm actually going to hand it off to Esmeralda Herrera to tell us a little bit about Communitas, our partner for the event, before we begin.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, John. So my name is Esmeralda. I'm Director of Programs and Community Relations at Communitas America. Now, for Communitas America, we are a nonprofit where we're working with change makers to create an inclusive, equitable, and community. And we do that in two major ways, but one of the ways I'm going to talk about is our Social Impact Accelerator program. And three of the panelists today are actually been involved at some scope with the Accelerator program. We have Maurelhena and Trey, who you'll hear, who've been actual winners, and Henry, who's actually been a judge at some of the entrepreneurs that have gone through our Accelerator. So we're super excited to be here and excited to be partnering up with Impact Hub. And if you want any more information about what we do or get involved with our Accelerator program, you can check us out at communitasamerica.org. And with that, I'm going to toss it right back to you, John Paul.
Thanks so much. So I'm really honored today also for us to have with us a very special moderator, who is Chrysula Winegar, who is Senior Communications Director at the UN Foundation. She is, from my experience, one of the most dedicated people to advancing the Sustainable Development Goals in the New York metropolitan area, and has a wide perspective in terms of how the Sustainable Development Goals are trying to be achieved across the world and the relevancy of local solutions. So it is a true honor to have you with us, Chrysula. And so I'm going to hand it over to you to conduct the event. Thank you so much.
John Paul, Esmeralda, thank you both so much, and really appreciate the Communitas America and Impact Hub New York metropolitan area teams for pulling this conversation together. I'm the one who gets to be honored because these three stellar panelists who, if you don't know already, you're going to get to know a little bit today, and you're going to be blown away by some of the creative and visionary work that they are all doing in their particular spheres of expertise. So I'm coming to you, before I introduce each of the panelists here, I'm coming to you from that perspective of really thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, both at the local level and obviously the global level. And we're particularly talking today about the Sustainable Development Goal number 3, or SDG 3. You'll hear me probably use the alphabet soup there. SDG 3, which is health and well-being. And if anything has brought us into crystal clear focus about the health impacts on each of our individual lives, it is the pandemic that we are all still experiencing, COVID-19. And 2020 and still well into 2021, we are not only seeing the cracks of inequalities that disparate health access offers or causes, we're seeing chasms, absolute chasms of inequality in terms of how this pandemic and how social structures have responded to this pandemic based on how well your area is resourced and the kinds of systems that you have at your disposal. But we're also here to do some because we know, Maurelhena, you were just saying in the pre-conversation that we all know the problem, and we don't actually want to spend too much time here talking about the problem, but we want to get a little bit of an idea of what's going on in the Bronx and how maybe some of that work in the Bronx is having ripple effects in other parts of the New York area, and really also how that's applying to different situations around the world. We want to maybe get some inspired and get some ideas. And so with that end, we will make sure we've got some time for some questions and answers with you, our audience, and we will appreciate the help of our hosts to make sure we get to your questions. And then we want to challenge some of your perceptions. And I think that Henry, Maurelhena, and Trey are really going to do that with us today. And so I want to kick it over to them a little bit. First of all, I'd love to have Maurelhena Walles introduce yourself, founder of Equity Design. Just give us a quick synopsis of some of the incredible work that you've been doing around health and the connectedness with physical activity.
So thank you so much. So my name is Maurelhena Walles, founder and CEO of Equity Design. And so what makes us unique is that we use data and an equity lens to really drive our decision-making around the type of physical activity program to provide communities. And why? Because each community moves differently. So the work that we do is to allow an assessment that would see, well, what barriers are keeping a school, keeping a community, keeping an organization from really using physical activity to get their community healthy. And so we work with the school, we work with the organization to really remove those barriers and provide physical activity that is meaningful and impactful.
So just hooking on to that, Henry, you've done some really fascinating work around the nutrition component here and challenging food inequities. So Henry Obispo, who is founder and CEO of Born Juice, again, give us just a quick synopsis of some of what you've been up to.
Yes, so Born Juice is what I like to call an eco-gastronomy hub, where we focus on not just sustainability as a whole, but the local population, taking into account the needs of the local population and offering access when it comes to food, when it comes to education, and also in the larger scope of this investment and what that means to the local population, but also in an even larger scope, which is the planet. And our relation to the planet, correlating with injustices, racial inequities, and also this sort of like systematic, I would say, oppression and food apartheid that we've been so accustomed to and been in many ways subjected to here in the Bronx. So in essence, Born Juice seeks to find solutions for those stark realities. And also my other venture, which is Reborn Farms, which is the first vertical farm here in the South Bronx, opening soon, addresses those issues at a larger scale.
So you've both touched on a couple of key health and wellness issues that are really critical for the community. And Trey, you're taking it to a different lens, and that is really tackling pollution and some of the causes of, things like air inequalities, right? Literally the quality of the air that we breathe in different parts of the city is different. So Trévon Gordon, who is co-founder of Vader Nanotechnologies, unbundle a little bit about what you're focused on.
Essentially what we do is we are searching for bacteria with the ability to eat novel pollutants. So one of our goals is to make this process as cheap and as efficient as possible. The goal ultimately being, if you can find these novel bacteria that with the ability to, let's say, break down pollutants, or in the future, like you just suggested about the Bronx, if they have the ability to help, let's say, pull some of those toxic chemicals out of the air, the difficult hurdle after that is how do you commercialize these things if it takes $1 million to just create the strain in the first place? So the critical component that we've really been focused on is how to make this work as cheap and as efficient as possible. And this is where computer vision gets wrapped into it. This is where automation gets wrapped into it. All these other things that we utilize to make that work more efficient. So that's essentially what we do in a nutshell. We're screening for these bacteria that eat environmental pollutants. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I told you all that you were going to be inspired today. This is just extraordinary. The components of each of what you're doing is just so motivational to me in terms of the kind of innovation that's happening and that it's happening right here in our own communities is incredibly powerful. But I did say we don't want to spend too much time on the problem, but I do just want to underscore a couple of issues and underline some of the things that Henry, Maurelhena, and Trey have just said, right, with some data. So the Bronx has been deemed number 62 of 62, the unhealthiest county in the entire state for the last consecutive 10 years, right? Life expectancy is 10 years less in the Bronx than it is in Manhattan. Manhattan is 85, the Bronx is 75. There are specific, as we mentioned, air quality issues, that there's a corridor of in the South Bronx where there's like a 4-highway sort of surround sound drumbeat of constant toxicity being released that changes the nature of the air for that community, and it's very different to the air quality in other parts of the city. Food deserts, which we've already talked a little bit about, and therefore triggering things like asthma and diabetes and heart disease, obesity, right? So this is the scope of the issue. So I want to actually pose this to all of you, but how is what you're doing for the health of the Bronx, how does it knock on to the health of the overall region? What's that thread that brings the health of the Bronx community to connect with the entire New York State, or at least New York City?
So I think what's interesting is, you know, New York City in general, like our focus right now is definitely on water, and how can we address pollutants that exist in our water. And it's interesting because I think New York City has some of the cleanest water in the world. So right now, what we're doing, I think if we can effectively identify organisms that break down certain pollutants, I'm not sure just yet, especially given with the quality of New York City's water, how we would necessarily use these organisms for addressing, let's say, pollution problems here in the city. But potentially, if we can think about other opportunities outside of the city, that might be really interesting. And then on the same note, aside from just the water quality itself, are there other, let's say, financial opportunities that come about from using bacteria to break down certain pollutants? The big thing that we've been focusing on is, can you, once you identify these strains, can you upcycle them into something else that might be of use, or let's say valuable? And one of the things that I know that a lot of people in the city do in general is collect water bottles and return them for some sort of cash refund. I'm just thinking way off into the future, but if there are opportunities where, let's say, that cash refund wasn't 5 cents, if it was 10 cents or 20 cents, because now plastic is, let's say, valuable, or some of these things that people might be gathering would be more valuable. That's the end goal of what we're trying to do, is can we turn these waste materials and potentially dangerous pollutants into something that are something valuable that we can turn into something positive. That makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. And Henry, how are you thinking about the Bronx as sort of a microcosm of health impacts throughout the system?
Yeah, so the Bronx, and specifically the Bronx, is so particular. But when we're thinking about the Bronx, within the Bronx, there are so many different areas. And I guess when people think of the borough, they think of, in many ways, in terms of the disparities where they are concentrated, many of them are in the South Bronx. And historically, it's a place that has suffered through a lot of disinvestment, but also the burning that happened in the 70s and early 80s. And so it also carries a stigma that has been, I would say, here and lasted for over 40 years. And in many ways, there's New York City and then there's the Bronx, in ways that people think of themselves in relation to where they live, and also the exclusion that exists within New York City, of the Bronx being this separate place and almost its own sort of like country. And we in the Bronx feel that, realities from others, and we also feel that we are our own culture, our own world. And in that sense, there is this sort of like split, but the reality is that the Bronx is part of New York City, and you can't deny that, even though for many generations it has been through disinvestment. And I think that specifically what I work on is how we engage the poorest congressional district, which is the South Bronx in the country, and use that as a model for other areas that are in high need also in New York City, but the Bronx being that microcosm of, disinvestment and poverty, et cetera, even though it's also filled with culture and incredible things, and how we can use that as a model. For example, the idea of eco-gastronomy, where you can have a vertical farm that is now supplying the local population. And that is a hyper-local system that happens now, especially because of COVID and everything we've gone through. We realize that our food system is overburdened and or does not really address the issues of inequity. And so in the larger scope of New York City, the Bronx, and the work that we're doing here in terms of access and creating access, not just to schools and restaurants and the local population and nicer public housing, the idea around much of the work that I do is that it's something that can be replicated. And in many ways, before I even think of these ideas, I always think of scale. And I think that New York City, once we launch, one of our projects, which is Reborn Farms, we'll use that as a gauge as to how to move forward in other areas that have been sort of left out and have been suffering pretty much for generations and are now hard hit because of COVID.
Yeah, I really want to come back to that idea of scale. So I want to park that, but we're definitely going to come back to that. Maurelhena, I wonder if you could just kind of take us to the next level. Then what happens if the Bronx and communities like the Bronx get the resources they need? What are we leaving on the table in terms of opportunity and just scope for achievement and success and whatever metrics you want to use there or adjectives you want to use there? What's the potential that's being hamstrung by the Bronx not having these kinds of opportunities around nutrition, around food, around health systems that are equal, et cetera?
When you were talking, I was thinking about power, like the power behind being able to have access to quality education, the power behind being able to have access to proper health care, to proper nutrition, to the technology to succeed. There's power in that. That power then leads to a socioeconomic status where you can build off of that, not just for yourself, but then for your family. And then that power creates legacy as you continue to build. That legacy creates generational wealth. And so the purpose behind equity design is, when I mention to people that, that the name of the company is going to be Equity Design, it's like, well, what does that have to do with fitness? It has everything. If Henry, you brought up the South Bronx, and your statistics are right on point. I cannot approach how I would do physical activity in the South Bronx the same way I would do in Hunts Point, or the same way I do in the section of the Bronx that people don't call the Bronx, Riverdale, but that's a conversation for another time. And so just thinking about the inequities that are in each of these communities, right? Then thinking about New York City on a greater scale, right? So the way I would do a program in Harlem is going to differ because that program in Harlem might have a large outdoor space. They might have access to Central Park. Whereas I'm going into a school in the South Bronx and they have 4 schools in one building, 1 gymnasium for close to probably maybe 100 plus kids. And physical activity and physical education just isn't a priority. Imagine if those kids, didn't have to have co-located space. Imagine if they were able to get physical activity. Why are we even talking about physical activity as a privilege and not just my right? And so all of these things, when I think about if we close the gap that exists between health and wealth, we give people power. And let me tell you something, as a part of the problem, people want access to quality. One of the common things when you think about it is that people want to be healthy. What's standing in their way is, I have to get to this job that pays minimum wage. I have to feed my family. I'm working a 12-hour shift. Am I thinking about working out physical activity? There's so many barriers, and when I said I wanted to start my business and I wanted to be in the Bronx, and we're talking about scalability as equity design grows, I'm going to continue to be in the Bronx. And so to continue to, just the business alone will create a workforce development. The business alone will create the visibility that is needed to be able to show the positive impact of the Bronx. I can go on, but I'm going to pause there.
No, well, I want to stick with you for a little bit longer, actually, Maurelhena, because, you know, can you just underscore for us a little bit more deeply, what role is physical fitness actually playing in this health equity equation? And, you know, or another way to ask it is, how is your socioeconomic status affecting your health status?
So, you know, I'm going to have to roll up my sleeves on this one right
bring it
here.
On. Bring it on.
Put the, you know, so really what it is if you think about it, you know, again, going back to, you know, I'm going to take a personal, my mom, you know, I was born in East Harlem, grew up in Manhattan, then we moved to Brooklyn, and physical activity was the last thing on my mom's mind. You know, here she is, you know, there's 3 of us and just a single income household, and sometimes working 8 hours, 12-hour shifts. And, you know, generation wise, she is high blood pressure. She's pre-exposed. That's a pre-existing condition she has, but this is the last thing on her mind because she's thinking about and taking care of us. And so the role that physical activity plays is just as important as nutrition, because it's all about taking care of your wellness, your health. The problem is that not everyone has had a positive experience with physical activity. And instead, it's seen as more or less something you have to do as opposed to something that you would want to do. You go to the doctor's office, the doctor says that you are overweight, although may not be overweight, but based on some statistics that has nothing to do with people of brown, people of color, brown and black, but now they're saying that you're overweight. And now you're saying that you're pre-exposed to all of these other conditions and you need to work out. What does that look like? And what does that mean if I go back to my community and I don't have a park that's safe to work out in? If the closest gym, dropping a fact of statistics for you, is in the Bronx, there's a little under 40 gyms in the Bronx compared to twice the amount of gyms in Manhattan. So where am I going to work out? Great. I do have my Planet Fitness, but I walk in, I don't know what to do. So the act of physical activity doesn't always have to be this CrossFit mentality. The act of physical activity is more about you moving to get your heart rate up, to get you in understanding what does movement look and feel like for you. And so in, you know, places in our communities in the Bronx, unfortunately, because we don't have access and we're working with so many health disparities, again, I created equity design to eliminate those barriers. And it doesn't matter, here in a limited space, we can get a workout on. Here in a community where you don't even understand how workout or movement works, I can get you smiling and laughing and want to be able to be a part of physical activity. So again, it's, you know, physical activity, unfortunately, is, you know, unfortunate fun fact. The Bronx has the Not 62 steering committee, but doesn't have a physical activity expert on their board.
Yeah, no, that integration is really critical. And you know, I'm just constantly seeing the parallels between what each of you are doing in your own spheres of influence as you're communicating. And I'm thinking about, as you're saying, Maurelhena, about, you know, going out for a run, for example, and then Trey, you're telling me that air quality is you know, significantly lower. So and so that makes that just an incredibly difficult challenge. So Trey, I want to just help everyone understand a little bit more about the focus of your research and what, help us know really what are these bacteria doing? What does it mean for them to eat pollutants? What are the knock-on effects if you can figure this nanotechnology out?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially what we do is we run a carbon source assay, and we run that on a robot called an Opentrons robot. So to put it in very simple terms, what bacteria need to grow, and what most of us need to grow, are a certain mixture of salts, a nitrogen source, and a carbon source. So we create a media that is filled with, let's say, all of those salts and the nitrogen source, but no carbon source. So let's say, for example, if we have a certain pollutant called PFAS that we want to break down, we would spike that media formulation with that PFAS chemical, and then we would figure out which of these bacteria, of many different bacteria, can actually use that carbon source. And let's say if you extend this work, actually, let me take a second before I get there. But the idea is that once you find these bacteria that can break down this specific carbon source, what you can do from there is you can think about how can you scale that system up. So what Henry was saying before was really great about how to operate at scale, because ideally, we know that it's not, of course, we need to be focused on our communities, but we also realize that these problems are massive and they're global. So how can we take what we're doing here in the city and put it somewhere in the Caribbean? How can we do it somewhere in one of the Indonesian islands, or one of these other places where these pollutants are just widespread, and we can also help them out with the same problems that we're facing? To circle back, one of the other things that we're thinking about on the air pollution side is, all right, so there's a number of different, just like we're figuring out how to, let's say, break down certain chemicals, there's a number of different emerging technologies that address removing specific molecules from the air. And that's something that actually a relatively new member to our team has been thinking about. How can we efficiently do that in the future? But it all ties together with the same basic idea that Maurelhena was expressing, is that if you don't have the resources, let's say, to do the appropriate research, or to even know what these things are, these chemicals, then you're going to be in as a disadvantage to, let's say, the other community who does have those resources to look into cleaning up their water supply or cleaning up their air. And it's really unfortunate. Right alongside with that, I'll just, as Maurelhena was speaking, I was thinking about, like, just alongside with the food, but also, sorry, skipped ahead. Right alongside with the exercise is the food quality. Like, you want to be making sure that you're putting things into your body that are going to positively affect you. And that's kind of, how we got onto this plastic and PFAS things, because that is, from our side, we look at that as a health issue that we can potentially help out with. But just like, I guess, hopefully giving Henry a good segue, food is just as important as the exercise. And we're right there with you in terms of the water and the air quality.
Yeah, absolutely. And you read my mind, Trey, because I'm headed back to Henry. And you started talking a little bit about models of equity, and I would love you to explain to us a little bit more about what those models look like and how they translate into sort of everyday behaviors in the community.
Yeah, so for me, I'm interested in pretty much everything that we've been talking about in terms of solutions-based and models. And the models that we've sort of been used to are really models that have been punishing to many of our communities. And in many ways, we default into them because for many of us, there isn't really a voice or I would say political push to make these changes. But I feel like this year, obviously, there is a seismic shift and a paradigm shift. And that crack in that, paradigm, that old paradigm, has now widened, where now when we're speaking about these ideas, they're not foreign to people anymore. Because now what we've been talking about here in the Bronx for so long, it's now resonates to somebody that has no idea about the Bronx. They've been able to live the fact that there was scarcity, even though they probably were affluent this past year. And they really saw that this food system that really works for all, or so most people think, really doesn't. And it actually didn't work for most of us, even those that had access. So the idea of systems and equity is at the forefront, I think, of the new world as we move forward. And that new world to me looks like that circular economy that in many ways we piloted here for about 4 years, where we now take into account these ideas of sustainability, the planet, the local population, but also creating pipelines. So we would be growing hyperlocal food, for example, here in the South Bronx, and engaging local restaurants to tap into that food so that they can now create access to healthy food and hyperlocal food, and then tap into the populations here in NYCHA Public Housing to be able to give them that produce at a very reduced cost or at times for free. And then also tap into the workforce by partnering with institutions here, like the universities, et cetera, to create that pipeline of jobs. So in the idea of a circular economy in the Bronx and that model, it has to work for us. And the way that it works for us is that now we see more people and tap into that population that can probably not get a job in agricultural technology, for example, which I'm in that field and I'm pretty much the only person of color in those rooms. So the idea is having a pipeline for those individuals and creating the system that now feeds each other and one another and uplifts everybody at the same time. So when we're talking about equity, it has to work for all of us.
Well, and you're really going back to this idea of the ripple effect, right? Of how these initiatives can operate not just through systems, and at the end of the day, systems are people, right? So human beings' lives within the immediate Bronx community, but it knocks onto the overall health of New York City. It knocks onto the overall health of New York State. It knocks onto the overall health and well-being of the entire country. And then, you know, Trey, you were bringing up the ways that you can apply the technology that you're working on in different market spaces where, you know, exactly the same issues are being faced. And so, you know, this is where I sort of put this is such a cliche, but my global hat on, right? The global is local, the local is global. You know, that to me just resonates so deeply that we have to think about this action happening in our immediate communities, but we also have to be thinking about how it applies and who can take it forward and move it in other spaces and places, because, you know, we know that inequities abound beyond our immediate communities. So I want to make sure that we start thinking about ways that we can specifically take action. And so Maurelhena, I'd love to start with you. And I like, if you had the bully pulpit of controlling all of the policies of Bronx health systems right now, what would be the sort of big asks that you would be making, or that you are already making, of policymakers, and what needs to change? Give us some concrete examples.
So one of the things that needs to change is that we have all these bureaucracies, right? So we have the Department of Health, Department of Education, and no one's talking to anybody. So in order to create and make our parks safe, we need to work with the Department of Parks. But there's also, you know, in the parks, there's also the substance abuse there. So maybe talking to the Department of Health, but then there's also safety. So then talking to the police. So everyone needs to talk to everybody. And I think what happens is, you know, especially with grassroots organizations, you know, they're trying, but then they'll say, well, we reach this roadblock, and like, well, we got to fill out this form, we got to fill out. And I understand there needs to be systems in place, but when the systems that are in place prevent you from doing the work that needs to be done in your community, I want to be able to make sure that as we look at, you know, the policies that are put in place, as we look at sort of, you know, what exactly a person or a group or organizations need to do to create healthier communities, let's make it accessible. Let's start to really cut the red tape and look at, hey, this is what your community can do. This is what you can do right now, as opposed to, well, we need to talk to this person, to talk to this person, to talk to this person. It really is discouraging. And even as an organization, you know, trying to work with political leaders to let them know, like, this is your community. You are the council person. You are the person that is really overseeing the initiatives in the community. And you see the data, what is being done. And the answers that you get, unfortunately, are, yeah, but we have to do this and we have to do that. Let's cut the red tape. Let's make solutions accessible. And let's really give it back to the community to be able to drive what they need, so that this way we can start to see the decline in the inequities.
Yeah, absolutely. I could not agree more. And there's a couple of comments in the chat that are sort of echoing this as well, about meeting the community where they are, setting goals with the community. And it also underscores for me just the critical nature of local elections, right? Like, everything is the ballot box at the end of the day. And, you know, election inequities is a whole other conversation, and being able to have the ability to vote, we'll leave that for another day. But for those that can, right, these local officials that they work for us. We are their bosses, and we just need to kind of beat that drum over and over and over again too. Trey, what would you like to see shifting on the policy level for the kind of work that you're doing and the problems you're trying to solve?
Number one, I think we have a lot to first understand, but as we start to like hit these next milestones when it comes to some of our partners who we work with in the remediation industry, I think one of the things that we've been seeing is there's been a lot of leeway given to certain groups who do the pollution. So let's say, for example, if a specific company was leaching the same PFAS chemical I mentioned before into the environment, they will be, let's say, finally brought up on charges, but potentially there needs to be maybe stricter regulation about how far of a leash these companies are allowed to have, because it's allowing these companies to do this kind of, let's say, detrimental behavior, is what causes these issues to become, let's say, citywide or statewide or nationwide or global. And if we can get ahead of that early, then I think that's going to be a huge factor. A lot of the stuff that I'm seeing right now around a lot of chemicals that have been around and been in the environment forever, there's no real policy around it, because essentially people say, well, the problem is so big, it's not even worth fixing at this point. And I feel like most of the people, if they understood what was in their drinking water in certain areas of the country, they would not be okay with that, regardless of whether or not there's a policy behind it. So I feel like it would be nice to see policymakers, let's say, make some changes in that area around what's allowable in our water. But again, maybe there's, on their side, I also understand there's a lot to understand, because these issues have gotten so large and have gone on for so long that just even understanding the scope of these issues is a research project in itself. But that's, I think, what I'd like to see is better policy around some of these pollutants that are being put into our water, and even into our air. So yeah.
Oh, absolutely. This is critical stuff. And again, it just reinforces that we have to try and do our best to be as informed as we possibly can about everything that's going into our systems, our personal systems. We're getting a couple of questions coming in, and I will open it up in about 1.5 minutes. But I do, Henry, would love to just turn to you to likewise ask for what are these sort of policy decisions or shifts that you're really agitating for and looking for?
Yeah, thank you. My focus really is democratizing food and access to food, and that looks like many different things. It looks locally, it looks like local governments advocating, being on the ground and realizing the realities and structurally shifting that. It also looks like, for example, what Maurelhena was talking about, the nonprofits. There is this, and in many ways, the nonprofits represent also advocates. But I would say that there is a culture there that is very, I would say, toxic, where it profits from poverty. And in many ways, there are no solutions in a lot of these nonprofits. And if you go, if you come to the Bronx, you would see that nonprofits abound here. They are everywhere, and we seem not to sort of like go anywhere. And so I would say that structurally, the focus has to like shift when it comes to these nonprofits and these advocates. And then when it comes to the democratization of food and access, you have to look at places like the Hunts Point Produce Market, which is the largest, arguably, in the world, that it employs so many people and it bypasses our communities. And how is that allowed, for example, for the place that is actually the most, I would say, fractured when it comes to food, is the same place that is the home and the host of this market. There is a disconnect, and I think structurally, policy needs to shift that. Also, when it comes to the greening, we're talking about greening, and we're talking about the Green New Deal. And those conversations will be ongoing. Policy-wise, for us to structurally change and shift the Bronx, for example, in places like the Bronx, that is an opportunity, a major opportunity for us to now focus on the need and now look around the need and see how we can engage greening that to get it out of that sort of dark, that darkness that it's been in for generations. So I feel like policy-wise, the Green New Deal and or the adjacent laws that people are thinking about are designed for places like the Bronx, specifically the South Bronx, to take it out of this, reality and bring it into equity.
Henry, Maurelhena, Trey, you're just teaching me by the minute here, and I'm so grateful for your expertise and your passion and your commitment around what each one of you are doing, not only in your immediate community, but as we've talked about repeatedly, the knock-on effects for other places and spaces in the United States and in the world. We have a couple of questions coming in, and in fact, Joel here has already taken my final question and phrased it much more eloquently than I had. So he says, you all have an engaged audience right now. What is your ask, and how can we help you with your specific initiative? So Henry, I'd love to start with you, and then Maurelhena, and then Trey.
Thank you. So my ask is for the audience to engage, to be aware, to seek information, and specifically in terms of moving forward this conversation is to allow and help us in many ways bring these ideas to fruition so that we are able to bring them to scale. I have particularly piloted this idea of the farm and the vertical farm and the circular economy for about 4 years. And now I will be bringing it to life as a concept, ideally with the city's help, as we are in talks. But to the people out there, I would ask that we would need help financially, we would need help, moral help, and also when it comes to just access to information and allowing us to tap into those channels that would allow us to bring those ideas and those resources here into these projects so that they are able to really build those ideas and the vision that we have for them.
I like the way that you compartmentalize it in terms of, and I'm gonna follow your lead, Henry, in terms of the people. For those that know me, they're probably scared. They're like, oh Lord, she's gonna ask us to do like 5 jumping jacks, and don't worry. Once we, we're gonna get there. I say to stand up, and you're like, what do you mean stand up? Yeah, stand up all day. More than likely, you're sitting down, you're at your desk. Stand up, go for a walk. When people think about physical activity, they think about this rigorous thing where they're sweating, pools of sweat, and they're exhausted. It's as simple as standing up, deciding to take the stairs instead of the elevator, deciding that during this commercial break or in between, I'm going to do some squats or whatever it is that your move is. To the people, I ask to move. Do not sit still. It is your health, and your health is exactly what my business is all about. To the organizations and to the schools, I am more than willing to work with you to look at how do we remove those barriers, because I fully understand that each community moves differently. So whether it's the barrier of a limited space, whether it's the barrier of a limited resource, don't let those barriers be the excuse for why you can't get healthy. You have a right to physical activity and to physical health. That is my ask. And I'm gonna kick it. Trey.
Yo, thank you for that. That was awesome. I'm going to echo you guys again with the information that you guys mentioned as being a key resource. Outside of the startup, and actually for a while, what funded the startup was me tutoring. And when I tutor, I really like making whatever science topic that we're going over as digestible as possible, and also very interactive, because I mean, that's the way that I learn. It's very pictorial and it's very interactive. And so just like you both said, information is, I think, one of the key pieces to getting us to a point where, let's say, we understand the resources around us and how best to utilize them, whether it be food or exercise or science. So there's three groups that I think that do a pretty good job at explaining the science, which is pretty near and dear to my heart. And that's going to be GenSpace NYC. The other group, not necessarily science, but a lot of information there, as well as Communitas. And then last but not least, Vader Nanotech. So if you guys would be willing to follow any of those three, maybe all of those three, that would be awesome. And hopefully we can teach you guys some things about science and about what we're doing over the long term. But yeah.
I love these calls to action. This is fantastic. I just want to check in with our friends at Communitas America and Impact Hub if we have any questions coming from Facebook, because I don't want to leave out that audience and I can't see their questions. And then also, just while they're gathering their thoughts, I want to, I'm assuming for all of you guys, if there are individual folks watching that want to connect with you, we can do that through either Communitas or Impact Hub fairly easily. So just reach out to whichever one of those organizations, and we'll get that figured out if there are specific cross-pollination ideas that you have and specific folks that you want to connect with. So Maurelhena, Henry, Trey, I want to just give you a chance to kind of conclude and just give any last thoughts that you have for this group. And I've just been making a little word cloud here on my little scribble here of like, words that just jumped out to me about what you were talking about democratizing, about activity being a right, about power, about education, about the very basic air, water, and food that we consume, seismic and paradigm shifts, right? These are, and then, advocating, and the sort of the biggest thing for me was access, not only to equity, but access to quality. And these are just sort of the threads that jumped out for me as each one of you was speaking. But I want to just give you a minute to kind of give us in tweet form, like 140 characters or less, your final, you can have a bit longer than that because I think it's more than that now, but just a quick sort of final encapsulation of what's that one takeaway that you want for people today, and then we will wrap.
Sure. I would say a takeaway would be that we are all interconnected. We know that much more now than we ever did. And we have to think about what's happening to our neighbor, because it's not too far from us and it could very well be affecting us. And in fact, it is. We tend to think and behave as if we operate in silos, and we can choose to sort of like detach from certain realities. But in this time, I would say that what we've learned is that you can't. And that actually wasn't ever really real. It was just an illusion that kept us going in a way that wasn't necessarily the best way for us, for humanity, and for the planet. And so now it's going to take all of us to rethink the way we've done things and the way we go about our lives, really. And that means that it's not only our everyday choices, but it's also looking next and looking sideways and seeing how we can engage our fellow friend, our fellow person, our fellow neighbor. In this case, a borough to another borough. In this case, a business to another business, and see how we can be of use, how we can be of help. And more importantly, how can we then really shift that reality that is so punitive for so many, and also not for others. And I think that is the homework for our new world and our lives moving forward. And the way that it applies specifically to what I've been talking about is about caring about others, caring about what other people are eating or not eating, caring about how they're living, caring about their environment, and in the greater scope, the planet, which involves all of us. That's really in a nutshell.
Absolutely, absolutely. Trey, I want to give you the next word, and then Maurelhena, you're going to give us the mic drop.
That was awesome, Henry. To go right off of your point of the interconnectedness, I heard someone say the other day that the future will be okay as long as we all don't act like it's going to be okay. The idea being that you have to actively build the future you want to see. And just like you're saying, we're all interconnected and we all know what's at stake, number one. Number two, we have many different people working on many different parts of the problem right now. And I think if we do continue to work together, like you mentioned, that becomes, number one, more possible, and it becomes a reality eventually. So I guess my parting words would just be continue to be diligent, continue to actively build the future, and continue to stay connected. And that would be it for me.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you. Maurelhena.
I was looking for my mic so I could drop it after I finish, but so, in hearing what everyone had to say and just in thinking about my why behind equity design and again, my personal story, it was really about community. The community that I was a part of really helped raise me. The community that I was a part of helped me build the athletic mindset that I have today. The community that I became a part of, last year through Communitas helped me reimagine what it means to be a social entrepreneur. I mean, everything that we're doing, between Trey, Henry, and myself is about impact. It's not about ourselves. It's about you. It's about the people that are in the community. We are doing this work, this selfless work, because we know personally the impact it has had on our lives in terms of not having. We understand the problem and we're really looking to be a part of the solution, but we can't do it without you. So when we call upon you, when you see the juice, or when you see, Trey dropping his knowledge about the impact of the environment, and when you see me talking about physical activity, shout us out, as Trey said, follow us, know more about what we're doing because we're doing it for you. I don't have a mic right now, but I have this mouse in my hand, so I'm just going to drop it right like that.
Brilliant. You are all just such fonts of knowledge, and I am so grateful to all of you for your time today, again, for your expertise, for your passion, and for your absolute commitment to your communities. Huge gratitude and kudos and respect to each one of you. I also just really want to thank Communitas America and Impact Hub New York metro area for bringing us together, and most especially all of you that have been watching and have been with us today. Feel free to share this conversation with others in your circles. It's on Facebook, and so it can be shared afterwards, and also reach out to Communitas America and Impact Hub for any connections that you're looking to make, and folks will do their absolute best. I want to just close us out by pointing to the fact that the Sustainable Development Goals that we started this conversation with at the very beginning, they are the pathway not only for the world, but for the Bronx, not only for the United States, but for the European continent and for the African continent and, you know, the entire planet. And so there's a system out there of 17 goals around gender equality, around ending poverty, around tackling climate change, around looking at life underwater, around looking at life on land, around looking at partnerships and how we all collaborate together, around, of course, health, which we've been largely speaking about today, but every element of health, from vaccine equity to nutrition, water, et cetera, mental health, our well-being writ large. So this movement, the Sustainable Development Goals movement, is something that I eat, drink, breathe, and sleep day in, day out. And I'm so excited to see what's happening right here in my own city. And I would just encourage all of you to also really check out and explore, if you're not already familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, to have a look at them and to give them a Google. You can go to globalgoals.org. That's an easy place to start. And just be aware that there's this agenda, this incredibly exciting agenda that every single member of the United Nations committed to their people that they would act on. So all 193 member states endorsed that agenda 5 years ago in 2015 and said, we're going to do this, and we're going to give ourselves 15 years to hit all of these targets by 2030. So the clock is ticking. We got 10 years to go. And as we've seen with the decimation of COVID, that we can't just rebuild or build back. We have to recover differently. And the SDGs are that pathway. So I would just bring you into that SDG family and invite you to check out and learn more about all of this. And we're just so thankful to have you all here, and just hope you all have a good evening or good day or good morning wherever you are in the world, and take care, everyone. Thank you.